Now I'll spend a little bit of time talking about CSS transforms and filters so we can add in more awesome visual eye candy to your projects. Looking at the example that we have here, we have some objects that have been transformed and then some images that have some basic filters applied. So we'll rock it through these and try and understand what's happening. So first to look at the transforms. Now within transforms there's a lot of things we can do. We can translate, which is move. We can rotate, we can scale, we can skew objects. And we can do this in both a two-dimensional manner and a three-dimensional manner. So instead of spending a lot of time going into each and every one, I've just done a little bit, and I will leave it to you to explore that a little bit more on your own so that you can learn how to do this. There's just a couple key things to keep in mind as we look at it. So with those three panels, which were all the same size, but now they've been modified and repositioned so that we can adjust their sizes, the way that it ends up working when I look at it, they're in a containing div and there's three images. So those images, as part of this containing div, that div has had its perspective set at 400 pixels, and the way that perspective works is the smaller the number, the more dramatic the perspective is going to appear, and the larger the number, the less dramatic that perspective is going to appear. Now, if we look at the very first of the panels here, we will see that it slants top and bottom as if it's going back in space, and we'll go back to a more modest value of say 400. And if I look at that particular object, I have translated it on the y-axis 200 pixels. It's a 400 pixel size image. Now looking at that, we can see that through that midline it equally slants up and down, where this image here is not. It's flat on the top and then the bottom is slanting up in perspective. So what's really at work here is these objects are repositioning themselves in space, and their top containing div is really, like in a traditional drawing sense with linear perspective, would be the horizon line. So the objects by default are starting at the horizon line and working their way down. That's why their top edges will be square. A few important things to keep in mind when we are working with these is with transform, if I specify one property, I don't say transform, do something else, transform, do something else, transform, do something else. Say transform, and then I list all of the different kinds of transforms that I wish to undertake at this particular option. So if I wanted to add something else to the middle picture, I would just put a space, and then I could say something like translate. And in this case, I'm going to do translate 3D because I want to actually push this object back in space. So I'm not going to move the X, so I'll just say 0. Now for the Y, I want to bring it up so it's centered on the horizon line. And then for the Z, I'm going to push it back in space. Now if I refresh my page, we'll see how now it got smaller and it pushed it back in space, because these are all the same image. And we can see how the text gets smaller. The text is skewed to line up with the perspective as the image is being rotated. Now this example in the first one, it may be confusing when you look at it because they look almost like individual style rules that I forgot a semicolon. But I put it on separate lines because I find it can make it easier if you're doing a bunch of different transforms, even so much as to say transform and then put each transformation on its own line. That can make it easier to read. You just have to remember that the semicolon goes after the last item. Otherwise, if you do just put it all in one line and do it like that, that is acceptable as well. So it's really a readability issue of how you wish to go about doing it. Now, looking at transforms, we'll see on the W3 School site, we can see a 2D rotation looks like this. A 3D rotation looks like that. So rotating on the y-axis. So as we do these different kinds of transformations, we can see here are our 2D transformations that we can work with. Translate as move, rotate as rotate, scale, skew, and matrix. We're not going to cover matrix right now. Moving into 3D, you will see that if we do translate 3D, then it allows us to specify all three of these at the same time. But if we say translate X, translate Y, translate Z, we can, if we're just doing one, we can do it that way. We can do a 3D scale. We can do a 3D rotation, so rotate it in all three axes simultaneously, or we can specify individual values. And it is possible to add the perspective for a single element instead of having the elements affected by their parent container. So you can modify the individual perspective value of a element by adding that to your transform method as well. So you can certainly go into it in more detail, and it can get fairly complex, but if you're creative with how you work with this, you could construct through CSS a pseudo rudimentary 3D looking environment, which would be really, really fun. The next item we're going to look at is working with filters. Now the CSS filters, you can see that there's a number of different filters. You can read through the details of them. And looking here, I've played with our place cage pictures again with blur and brightness, contrast, drop, shadow, grayscale, hue, rotation, inversion, opacity, saturation, and sepia. I even did opacity on this box up here before because it was overlapping with the other boxes so that you could understand how they were overlapping until using translate to actually slide them apart. Now, looking at the CSS that goes into this, you'll see that with the filters, it's fairly straightforward. Where blur, we just put in how many pixels we want it to blur. Brightness, 0 to 1 will make it darker. Anything greater than 1 makes the picture brighter than its original value. Contrast, same thing. Drop shadow, we specify how far we want it shifted X, shifted Y, then how much blur or how big we want the shadow to kind of bleed out, and then the color we wish to use. Grayscale, this allows us to choose how gray we want the image to go. It's a scale of 0 to 1. So if we change that to 1, go back to our image, file and refresh, now we can see it's completely gray. And if I do a value of 0.2 and refresh, you'll see that it's slightly gray. It's more of a desaturated version of itself. Hue rotation is much like working with shifting the colors using the hue saturation adjustment layer inside of Photoshop, where you can now just take and slide the colors over. So now we've shifted the colors over 90 degrees. If I were to say 180, we'll see how now it's shifting. So all colors are just shifting on the color spectrum. Inversion does exactly what it looks like. Key thing on inversion, one is totally inverted, and if you do 0.5, it is exactly halfway between inverted and not inverted, and what's really interesting to see what happens there is the whole image turns gray. Now if I did 0.6, you would see it's mostly inverted, but it's still really gray. Opacity is 0 to 1. 1 is solid, 0 is transparent. Saturation, 0 to 1 decreases, greater than 1 increases the saturation of the colors. So just for kicks, we'll boost that up. Then we'll look at the saturation here and see how it becomes oversaturated. And sepia is if you want to go make your pictures look like old-time style photos. None of this is really complex. Transforms are more so, filters fairly direct. The important thing is to experiment and play and look at the reference and change values to come to an understanding of how to work with it. The good part is if you're effective in this use of using the CSS filters, you're able to work with image assets without having to make different versions of them or keep going back into Photoshop to modify them with their color or their saturation or their blur or any of those other things. Modify it, resave it, re-upload it, because you're just changing it in the CSS. So that gives you significantly greater flexibility and control. Good luck.